and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the New Construction Marketing Podcast. I'm your host, Anya Christianthen, and I'm really excited to introduce my guest for today. It's Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. He is a disaster avoidance expert and an author of Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. It's really a first book to focus on overcoming the dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases. So I'm so excited to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining me. And I like to begin the show usually by introducing you. So if you don't mind telling us a little bit about your background, what's your story and how did you end up where you are today?
Thank you for inviting me on the show, Anya. It's a pleasure, and I'll be happy to share about my background. Well, it all goes back to my childhood when I saw my parents making some pretty bad decisions with each other. They fought a lot. I mean, they were both people who, when they felt something was right, then they believed it was right, which is the definition of going with your gut, right? You feel something is right, then you do it. And they both felt that, and unfortunately, they often felt that different things were right. So, for example, my mom, she liked buying, not very expensive things, but like a sweater for $50. My dad was like, well, no, sweater should never cost anything over $20, and they'd go off on it again. So it's just kind of that sort of conflict. And that was the kind of things I already as a kid, so I felt and I saw that was just kind of dumb to have these conflicts. They really had much more conflicts than the matter was worth. And there was one especially bad time. So my dad was a real estate agent, meaning he worked based on commissions, as you know, and he had a variable income. Sometimes made more money, sometimes less. And as part of that, he at one time, that he had a pretty good few months, so he had made a bunch of money, but he hid it from my mom. And he invested it into buying an apartment, small apartment on the side, which he leased out. Now, once she found out several years later, she was really pissed. She was very angry. It was a big, huge blowout fight, and got into issues of trust. And so anyway, they separated for a while. They eventually reconciled, but she could never really trust him again. And as a kid, seeing that, my dad living away and kind of that big blowout fight and all these conflicts, that really shaped me and made me really fascinated by why and how we make our decisions, especially how we make bad decisions, how we can address these bad decisions. So that's kind of from my childhood. Now, I was born in 81, so then I came of age.
I'm sorry, you said you were born where?
81. I was born in 1981.
Okay.
So I was born in 1981, and I came of age during the dot-com boom and bust. Mm-hmm. Those people who remember 1999 was the big year of the tech boom, when all companies like Webvan, Pets.com, Boo.com were booming. And I was 18, and just in a couple of years later, when I was 21, 2002, they all went bust. So people who were tech leaders, they would, 1999, partying like it's 1999, for those who remember that Prince song. Maybe it ages me. But that was something that I saw these people being the heroes on the front pages of the Wall Street Journal, and then they were the zeros just a couple of years later. And even worse were people like Bernie Ebbers and other leaders of WorldCom, Tyco, Enron, who hid their losses for their companies from the dot-com bust by using fraudulent accounting methods. Now, they knew that it couldn't last. A couple of years later, they were doing the perp walk, going into jail for a long period of time. They knew they couldn't last, but they made these terrible decisions to try to cover up their losses. And that was also fascinating for me. Why did so it's not only my parents, it's these big business heroes who were just suddenly zeros. And so clearly there's a problem in our society. People going with their intuition, making really bad decisions. So I decided to study this topic. And I studied it. I became a trainer, consultant, coach in it, which I've been doing for the last couple of decades. And I also went into higher academia. So I became a cognitive neuroscientist, behavioral economist, and that's part of my background. And then I summarized all of that into my background in cognitive neuroscience and behavioral economics, so cutting edge research, and case studies drawn mostly from my clients for over 2 decades, as well as some prominent things that everyone would hear about, like the Bernie Ebbers stuff. And I summarized them into my book, Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, right there.
Got it. Well, thanks so much for that. So obviously when you shared the book with me, my first gut reaction was like, whoa, 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 whoa. What do you mean never go with your gut? I mean, this is what we hear is go with your gut. If you're not sure about what to do, you go with your gut. So tell us why not? What's the premise? Like why shouldn't we go with our gut? I mean, it seems opposite of everything that we've ever been told, right?
Yeah, and so if you remember back to the 19, a century ago, when doctors would tell you to drink snake oil mixed with, which was a mixture of essentially cocaine, alcohol, and sugar. That
Hey,
was
that sounds
that
like a
was
perfect combination.
There you go. That was the best medical advice at the time when
Mhm.
these medical experts were giving that, because it was something that sold well. People liked to buy it. Obviously, the cocaine, the sugar, the alcohol made people feel good. And it was not, but it wasn't actually curing the disease. It was just addressing the symptoms, so to speak. So people felt good about getting it. They felt it was pleasant, it was pleasurable, just like all the sorts of advice to go with your gut feels good. That's the nature of gut feelings, that what's comfortable. When someone tells you to go with your gut, they tell you do what's comfortable. That's what they're telling you to do the comfortable thing.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, our feelings of comfort
Mhm.
are actually not adapted for the modern environment. They're adapted for the savanna environment. When we were hunters and foragers living in small tribes, you know, 15 to 150 people, and
Mhm.
surviving by hunting and foraging. So that's what our gut reactions are adapted for. That's what we feel comfortable with. So think about it. You have two primal aspects that are really important to consider. One is tribalism, and that has two important components. We tend to like people who look like us, who think like us, who believe the same things we do, and not like people who don't. It was very important for us in the savanna environment to have that in order to survive, because if our tribe got defeated because we weren't tribal enough and we weren't loyal enough, we would die. And if we were kicked out of our tribe, we would die. So it's good for us to like people who are like us, part of our tribe, and to not like people who weren't. Unfortunately, in the modern complex business world, you have to work a lot with people who aren't like you in order to succeed, in order to survive and thrive, right? And so that is a bad pattern that causes a lot of damage right now. Another bad pattern was another aspect of tribalism. It was really important for us to advance in the tribal hierarchy, get as high as possible. Those were the people who survived, thrived, and reproduced and spread their
Mhm.
genes. So we're the descendants of people who are very tribal in both aspects.
Mhm.
The tribalism in terms of liking people who are like us and disliking people who are not, and those who got to the top of the tribal hierarchy spread their genes. Of course, that's really bad in many business contexts. What you see with people like Bernie Ebbers at WorldCom and Tyco, and Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, is these leaders, they chose to use fraudulent accounting methods because they did not want to fall from the top of the tribal hierarchy. They did not want to be seen as losers. They did
Mhm.
not want to lose that social status. And of course, they made horrible decisions that caused their companies to go bankrupt and many, many millions of people to lose their life savings, essentially. It's people who, especially who are in employees of these companies, invested into retirement accounts. That really is frustrating for me because I really care about people and I really care about addressing suffering. My values are utilitarian. So that's something that I'm seeing and I'm like, okay, these primal tribal responses are really harmful. Another aspect of decision making that comes from the tribal environment is the fight or flight response. So where we needed to jump, our ancestors needed to jump at 100 shadows in order to flee from that one saber-toothed tiger or to fight an attacking tribal member.
Mhm.
In our current business environment, we have many, many less saber-toothed tigers, but we still react to threats by making very, very, very quick decisions, react to external stimuli by making very, very, very quick decisions that are either defensive or aggressive. And
Mhm.
that is very harmful. And that's where these cognitive biases come from that I'm talking about. So these dangerous judgment errors that cause us to make terrible decisions in the modern business environment. Many, many of them come from our evolutionary background. Some of them come from other aspects of how our brain is wired, just because of the way we process information. So that this is a danger of following what's comfortable, of doing what's comfortable. Instead, what we need to do, we going with what's primal, what's savage, what's intuitive, what's instinctual, the gut reactions, that feels good, but it doesn't actually result in the best results right now. Similarly, it feels good to eat as much sugar as possible, as much candies as possible. It feels good, because in the savanna environment, it was very important for us to eat as much as possible when we had sources of food, especially sugar. So that was very important. But right now in the modern world, that's very harmful. It might feel very good to sit on the couch and watch Netflix all day, but it's pretty harmful to not put on your sweats occasionally and go to the gym or walk. So we know that medicine is far advanced from where it was 100 years ago of about eating all the foods. Hopefully, if a doctor tells you to eat a dozen donuts and sit on the couch and watch Netflix, you would not want to go back to the doctor, although it might feel good.
And have some cocaine with it while you're at it,
There
right?
you go. There you go. So right now, unfortunately, the people who get paid big bucks in business are the people who tell you to do what's comfortable, because people like to pay for someone to tell them what they already feel like doing, what they're comfortable with. And that's why going with their gut is very, very dangerous business advice. It's very harmful, but people like it. And we're only on the cutting edge of the research in business literature, evidence-based business. This is the first book popularizing cognitive biases. There's a lot of stuff on them in dense academic journal articles that are $30 per pop, and that would be hard for you to get through. So I read all of those, and I'm popularizing them in this book. Never go with your gut: how pioneering leaders make the best decisions and avoid business disasters.
So that's interesting. So you're saying basically that our intuition and our gut reaction is designed to keep us safe, just because of many, many years of evolution, that at some point it was useful. Now it's actually could potentially work against us. So if we can trust our intuition, which I'm still not 100% sold on, because
Sure.
again, I do trust my intuition, and I feel like it has led me to a lot of right decisions. But if you're saying we cannot trust our intuition, then how do we make a decision? Like, what is there a path that we need to figure out? Is there a blueprint? Like, how do we make decisions if intuition is not something to trust?
So what we need to do is learn about all the ways that our intuition goes in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of these cognitive biases that are described in the book. You can check it out, the list of cognitive biases on Wikipedia. There's going to be a list of over 100. I summarized in the book the 30 most dangerous ones for businesses, professional settings, and how to address them. So what you want to do is learn about them and then learn specific steps to address these problems. In the same way, your intuition about what foods to eat is screwed up. I think we can all agree on that. There's sugar, that's bad. Your intuition is screwed up on how much and what kind of foods to eat. Your intuition on not going to the gym is screwed up. All of these intuitions, there are lots of places where we already understand that it's screwed up. Your intuition on how to eat foods is on the process of eating is screwed up. When you were a kid, you ate with your hands, and that was a very natural savanna primitive thing to do. Right now, you most likely eat steak with your fork and knife. You might still eat pizza with your hands, and that's totally great. And if you eat pizza with your fork and knife, you're weird. But your intuition on how to eat foods had to be retrained, and your intuition on which foods to eat had to be retrained. Your intuition on how to exercise, your physical fitness, had to be retrained. So what you need to do is retrain your intuition, your emotions, your feelings. You need to change them in order to be aligned with what's best for the modern world. You already are doing some of that without realizing it. So for example, the natural thing to do with constructive critical feedback by your boss, by your supervisor, or by a client, if you don't have a boss, by, let's say, a client. The natural thing to do when you get constructive critical feedback is to say, no, that's wrong. I'm awesome. That, to feel that defensive aggressive response, whether defensive, where you can shut down and just ignore it, or aggressive and shouting back, whichever one you're prone to. But if you've succeeded in your business, you've learned that that's not the best way to deal with constructive critical feedback. You have learned to do the uncomfortable, unintuitive, hard step of, hey, considering the feedback, seeing what's useful, and incorporating it into your performance. Mm-hmm. This is one of the reasons that people who are just entering their professional jobs, they need to be given a lot of training on how to deal with constructive critical feedback, right? Because it's not intuitive, it's not natural. So you can't trust your intuitions on that. And in the same way, there are a lot of techniques that you can use to address bad decision-making tendencies that your intuition causes you to engage in. For example, there are lots of people who think that they can tell apart who's lying and not. There are lots of people who think that. Unfortunately, they're overwhelmingly wrong. If you look, there are extensive studies showing that people who are trained, security officials, FBI, CIA, police forces, who are trained on how to tell apart a person they don't know whether that person is lying or not, they're trained to do it. And then when they're given tests on whether they can tell apart, they only succeed at the rate of something like 52 to 44, 54%, which means it's like just better than a coin flip. So don't trust your intuition that you can tell whether someone is lying or not. And I may be telling you something that's very uncomfortable, but it's true. We can't. People are much better at lying than we are discerning lies. So that's an example where you can't trust your intuition. There are a lot of other areas which we can go into called the cognitive biases, and I can go through them one by one, give you examples of where your intuition can't be trusted. So we have a lot of areas where your intuition can't be trusted, and what we need to do is retrain our intuition, retrain our gut reactions to go from that natural primitive state to a civilized state, which is, eating with your fork and knife is civilized, engaging with constructive critical feedback effectively is civilized, and so on. The book talks about a lot of techniques and strategies that you can use to get your intuition civilized and actually have it aligned with the modern business environment.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these cognitive biases. So you said there's over 100, and that there's 30 that are most prominent. So let's talk specifically as it relates to sales, because I think when it comes to money and parting with money, most people behave very strangely, right? Either we tend to overspend and we're super easy to sell on something, and it seems that most salespeople are actually that way. Like I am, hey, I'll read one page of whatever. It's like, I don't need to go any further, like click buy, whatever. I'm the easiest sell. And then there's the opposite of people that almost have a negative reaction just because it's a sales process, and they're terrified and they tend to run away and panic. So can you talk about some of the top cognitive biases that affect salespeople and the consumer behavior that we could potentially be aware of? And how can we maybe influence people better, knowing that those are some of the biases they may have?
So one of the most important biases in the process of the sale itself is called the false consensus effect. False consensus effect refers to the idea that we are actually pretty bad at telling what other people are thinking. We anticipate, we assume that they are more similar to us than they actually are. So a lot of salespeople make very basic mistakes because they're trying to sell to themselves. They are trying to sell to somebody who is like them. And that's a fundamental error that you might be yourself an easy sale. And so you would tend to think that other people are an easy sale. Or it might be a very complicated, you might need a lot of intellectual information, and you would actually give that to other people a lot of intellectual, analytical, technical information. But other people are very different than you, most likely. So what you need to do much more is focus on what other people need rather than what you would like to give them. One of the big problems in sales is standardized sales literature, where there's same brochure for everyone, rather than customizing the sales materials specifically for the needs of each individual client. So customizing the sales pitch individually for the needs of each client. So that's kind of one of the really interesting things that you need to be thinking about, the false consensus effect.
Love it. So you guys, this goes back directly to knowing your customer. And how do we know our customer? Is by the discovery process, right? That's why you want to make sure that you're asking all of the questions in the beginning so that you understand what's important for that client, what's driving their behavior, and the way they're going to communicate with you. They're pretty much going to tell you how they want to be sold, right? So if we know this information, then you can pitch them the way they want to be pitched, right? Because if you're going to present to them in a way that they want to be sold, instead of taking them through this big process where maybe they're already there, or it's the opposite, right? Maybe they they're here and you're there, and you need to still bridge that gap. So you have to make sure that you're reading your client, and what better way to do it than discovery process. So asking the questions. And I love what you said about customizing the brochure and customizing that experience for you. So you guys, if you caught my recap from the Tech Home Builder Summit, Tim Costello of IBX was talking specifically about customization. And so think about how even your brochure on your website could be customized to that particular client depending on the actions that they take on your website, right? Instead of just giving them generic brochure with everything in it, it could potentially generate something that is specific to them based on the decisions they made, based on the links they clicked when they were visiting your website. So I think this is a huge one. Customization is going to be something that customers demand more and more as we continue down this Amazon path and the world of, you know, how everything around us is customized to you. And we expect the same thing from when we buy a car, when we buy a house. So that's a huge point, and that's something you guys should definitely pay close attention to. All right, love that. So false consensus, that's a big one. Okay, so what other cognitive biases that we can learn and apply to in sales?
A crucial one is the empathy gap. So something that salespeople often tend to struggle with. So empathy gap tends to refers to us underestimating the impact of emotions and underestimating the impact of other people's emotions. And salespeople are a lot, I see this mistake very often, are quite, I wouldn't say intellectual, but they kind of try to sell on the rational level. They tend to sell rationally. And what the research on this topic shows is that we are overwhelmingly emotional decision makers. About 80 to 90% of our decisions are driven by our emotions. So if you're not looking at people's emotions, you're missing 80 to 90% of the sales process. That is what is actually driving these people to sell. And what we know, we've done extensive studies, and we know that what people really appreciate is salespeople who are engaged in active listening. Active listening meaning looking at you, meaning helping you feel like you're cared about, that they're not just generally, you know, I had my financial advisor come to me about 6 months ago and propose this new fangled whatever the thing that he was trying to sell to me. And he was, you know, just saying that, hey, this is great, everyone's buying it. He wasn't really looking at my reactions. He wasn't asking what I wanted. He wasn't looking at my goals. And that was a big problem that ended up with me not buying his product, and you know, which might have been good for me or might not have been good for me. But because he really was just doing a generic pitch and he wasn't looking at my reactions, my emotions, that was a huge problem. So active listening, that you want to focus a lot on. Then the other part that you want to do, so this is part of the broader part of the empathy gap, what you want to do is echo and mirror. So not simply listen actively, which means paying attention, making mental notes. If you can't make written notes, try to make written notes if you can. You want to echo what the other person is saying. You want to mirror their posture to the extent that's reasonable, and you want to summarize their words in your own words. So echoing, mirroring, reflecting. And then you want to build rapport, show that you're on the same side, show that you care about them, that you care about their goals. Try to, if you are not certain about their emotions, try to reflect their emotions, saying something like, hey, I hear you're anxious about, you know, point X of the sale. And if you hit the right emotion, then you'll say, yes, you know, you will see them light up. You will see them be reflected in it. And if they're like, no, I'm actually not worried about this. I'm worried about this other part, then you will still get what they're worried about. So you want to always be focusing on other people's emotions. We intuitively underestimate other people's emotions, the importance of emotions. So that's going to be a crucial one for you to look at.
Yes, I love that. So I think a lot of salespeople underestimate this one. They think that people buy with logic, and that's why a lot of salespeople tend to bombard customers with logic, such as instead of concentrating on benefits, they talk about features. So that's why you always go with benefits over features, right? Even if you're talking about features specific features of this home, say it's an energy efficient home, instead of talking about it being energy efficient home, how can you turn that around and concentrate on what is the benefit of that? Maybe talk about how this home is so much more comfortable to live in because it is energy efficient, how this home is going to save you all this money because it is energy efficient. And the more emotional you can get, the better. So I heard this, there was a research study done, and basically they studied patients who recovered from a stroke. And what they said was they studied that particular part of the brain that affects people's emotion. Mm-hmm. And for stroke victims who were affected by a stroke in that particular area of their brain, where that part of their brain was no longer functioning properly, they found that they could no longer make decisions. They found that they couldn't make even simplest decisions because they were not connected to the emotional part of their brain. And you would think logically that, oh my gosh, if I didn't have emotions involved, it would be so much easier to make a decision, because it's like, okay, white, black, fact A, fact B, it would be so much easier to make a decision versus getting my emotions involved in this. But it's the complete opposite. So they said, if you're missing your emotions because of something that happens to you, you actually lose ability to make decision completely. So you guys, this is gold. So, okay. So this almost seems like, almost like contradictory in a way, because if you're saying like, okay, we need to be emotional about it, it almost goes with the gut reaction, right? When we're making those decisions. So it's
No, not at all. Your gut reaction is your emotions, but your emotions may not be trained to deal well with the modern environment. Mm-hmm. You might come to like exercising, but that comes from a place of initially not liking exercising. So your basic primitive gut emotions, your natural savage state is going to be pretty problematic. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm saying. You need to train your emotions.
Decisions, but it just may be a wrong decision when we make based on emotion.
Exactly. So you need to retrain. And I'm not saying your emotions are going to be exactly just as strong, but they will be in a different channel. You will tend to be, you can develop pride in looking good and in feeling good after exercise. But that comes after a lot of effort, mental effort in developing that pride. It's not a natural thing, not an intuitive thing. So in the same way that right now, you're saying that salespeople need to think about people's emotions. You've learned that. And it's not a natural, intuitive thing. We don't intuitively and naturally sell to people based on emotions. We naturally, intuitively sell to people based on logic, because that's how we intuitively feel is the right way to sell. Whereas it's really not the right way to sell. And we intuitively feel that the right way to communicate is to bombard people with information, like the false consensus effect we talked about. And it's not the right way. We don't customize the information to people as much as it should be. So these are all examples of where our intuition on how to sell well leads us in the wrong direction.
Got it. Love that. That you totally nailed that one. Okay, so we talked about false consensus. We talked about the empathy gap. What are some of the other cognitive biases that salespeople tend to deal with?
Let me give you one more, and then we move on to how to solve them. Quick technique
Perfect.
on how to solve them.
Love that.
One huge one is the optimism bias. So it's kind of like it sounds. Salespeople tend to be incredibly optimistic. They tend to have too high expectations. They tend to have too high perceptions of how well they will do in their sales, especially when they had a good year or a good quarter the previous quarter. They think that their next quarter will go even better. Not the case. There's a very common phenomenon called recession to the mean, which means that you probably have an average level of selling. If you had a good quarter one year, you will most likely have a worse quarter the next year, because it will be closer to average. And the same thing for bad quarters. Your next quarter will not be as bad, most likely, because it will be closer to average. So we don't tend to realize the kind of way that the optimism bias causes us to make bad decisions. So a really helpful way of addressing the optimism bias is to predict in advance what will happen. And hold yourself to these predictions. So say, will I make this sale, or how many sales will I make, or what will be the money at which I will sell this? make that prediction before every sale and see how much you're off. I will, almost every case, salespeople are off by they're optimistic by about 30 to 60%. That's what I see
Wow.
when working with salespeople, 30 to 60%. So you want to figure out how optimistic you are as an individual. How optimistic are you about the likelihood of making the sale? How optimistic are you about how much money will be involved in the sale? And how optimistic are you about your sales figures for the month or the quarter or whatever is relevant to you? That way, you can over time adjust yourself to be, you shouldn't get rid of the positive feelings of the optimism, but you should get rid of the excessive expectations of the optimism, because that just hurts you in your planning going forward. And so you could become a realistic optimist. You could still have that high positive feelings and hopes while bringing down the expected numbers.
Love this. So it's like hope is not a strategy. So you guys, in episode 70, I talked about creating your marketing calendar going into 2020. And one of the steps that I talk about is actually looking back to the year before to look at your numbers, because unless you know what your numbers are, it's going to be really, really difficult to achieve that goal because of that exact optimism bias, because you always think you're going to do better than you actually will. So one of the things I recommend is that if you know how many sales you need to achieve, you should look at the year before and see how many you actually sold versus how many people, how many traffic units you saw in order to achieve that goal. And then divide that number of traffic units by your sales to figure out what's your conversion ratio. So in other words, how many people you actually need to see in order to sell one house. Now, if you know that ratio, and again, the more time frame you have, the better off you're going to be, because again, it's going to vary from community to community depending on difficulty of selling in a particular community. But if you know on average you need to see 10 people in order to sell one house, well, and if your goal this month is to sell 3 houses, you need to come up with at least 30 traffic units. And if you're not seeing those 30 traffic units, guess what? You can just hope that somebody's going to come in through the door and magically want to buy a house from you. So you got to do something about that to drive that traffic so that at least you're connecting the numbers to the results. So yeah, that's a huge one. I think this one we see a lot with salespeople, especially at the end of the month when you ask them, well, your quota was 3, you're at 2. Do you think you're going to be able to come up with it? And it's like, oh yeah, totally. I have this hot prospect, or this guy, he's definitely going to buy. This person's definitely going to buy. And then the time passed and it's like, what happened? Oh, well, didn't work out. So, okay. So be optimistic, but be realistic about it. And that starts with knowing your numbers.
So that's where it really helps to, again, channel your emotions in the right direction. Still be positive, still have your emotions motivate you, but make sure that your numbers are not going to be fudged by your emotions.
Yes, definitely know your numbers. All right. And then you said there's something we can do to actually overcome some of those biases. So how do we train our brain? How do we do this? How do we get better?
So my book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, talks about specific ways to address each cognitive bias. And I gave you an example with the optimism bias, how you would address that. It also gives you 2 techniques to address both large, huge projects, which are going to be very important projects. And that technique takes about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on whether you're doing it with yourself or with a team. So that's for really big ones, really, really impact your bottom line. There's also a quick technique. Takes only a couple of minutes. That's for your everyday decision making, whether when you're going out to see a prospect or when you're choosing which prospects to see, where to direct your energy on a certain day or a certain week, an important email to write or so on. Something that you don't want to screw up, but where you don't really need to maximize the outcome. So this is for you to not screw up. Maximize the chance of you not screwing up rather than get the highest profit, make the perfect decision. So you ask yourself 5 questions. 5 questions about any decision you don't want to screw up. First, What important information did I not yet fully consider? So what evidence didn't I take into account? The critical thing here is that we will be tempted to only look at evidence, cherry pick evidence that is favorable to whatever we would like to see happen. That is favorable. If we think that we will make the quota by the end of the month, and we have two, and we have have two, we need three, and we only have 3 prospects, whereas we generally know we need 10 prospects to make a sale, we will be tempted to believe that those prospects are much better than they actually are.
Mm-hmm.
Bad thing. You don't want to do that. You want to be realistic about your assessments. So that is just one of many ways you tend to get screwed up on this decision-making process, because you don't want to give your sales manager the wrong numbers. You want to give him or her the bad news early rather than disappoint them at the end of the month, right? You're going to say, well, I have pretty low likelihood of making it this month. And then your sales manager will learn to trust you. They will learn that what you say will actually likely happen, rather than you are too optimistic and you're not trustworthy, right? Not a good thing. So
happened to all of us, I think, at some point.
Exactly. So now that you can actually address that sort of problem, you can become more trustworthy in the eyes of others. Mm-hmm. Second, what dangerous judgment errors, what cognitive biases did I not yet fully consider? And of course, each decision has its own cognitive biases. When you're making your plans, you want to address the optimism bias. When you're talking to a customer, you want to address things like the false consensus effect and the empathy gap. And of course, the book has 27 more other cognitive biases that you need to address if you want to make sure to have a successful and thriving sales career. Third, what would a trusted and objective advisor tell me? So think about Anya. What would she tell you to do? Think about someone you trust. Who is an objective advisor, a trusted advisor in this topic? What would they tell you to do in this situation? That really helps because it takes us outside of ourselves. Anya would tell you to, hey, if you only have 3 people, you're not likely to make your quota. And that helps you take it outside of yourself. Sometimes just having about 50% of the time, just asking that question helps you have a much more accurate answer to whatever decision you're making. And the rest of the time, if you're still not sure, just call that person, or if you're a millennial, text that person, whatever you need to do. Have that person.
Hey, everyone likes texting, so not just millennials.
So fourth, how have I addressed all the ways this decision can fail? So think about whatever project you're working on, whatever decision. Imagine that it completely failed, absolutely failed. And then think about what are the reasons why it failed. What are the plausible reasons for failure? Then see how you can address them in advance. So if you think your monthly quota might fail, maybe you can line up more prospects or something like that. You can do that in advance and prevent your monthly quota from being a failure. And of course, there are contingencies. You can develop contingencies for unexpected situations occurring. So if a sale was going to go through, but it fell apart at the last minute, what can you do to try to save the sale? If you don't have a contingency plan to save the sale, then you're going to be kind of running around like a chicken without your head. But if you have a contingency plan, you can dive right in and try to make it work. Finally, what new evidence would cause me to change my mind? What new information would cause me to revisit this decision? This is a critical question because when we're in the middle of a sales process or any sort of decision, we're very close to it. We're very emotionally invested in it. It's very hard for us to pull away. But if we make a decision in advance saying that, hey, given this evidence, I will change my mind. I will revisit the decision. Maybe let's say you are someone who's has a difficult and complex sales cycle. So each sale is large, but it takes a little while. You might want to back out of a sale if you see that it's not going to go well and that you're going to waste your time. But if you don't make a decision right away, what are the signs? If I see these 3 signs, that means I need to back away from the sale and try to go to my next prospect. If you don't set that barrier in advance, you will tend to be way too invested in each sales process and you will waste your time. You will lose opportunities to make other sales. So that's just one example of how it applies to sales, and there are many more. And so these 5 questions will greatly help you address a lot of problems, a lot of risks, a lot of issues that you wouldn't address otherwise.
Love that. So you guys, I will summarize the 5 questions if that's okay with you. And you guys can grab it in a cheat sheet. So I'll link it to the episode. It's going to be under anyakhristyantan.com/073 download. And then you can have those 5 questions in front of you. So anytime you have a decision to make, you can go down that list. And you know what? I bet you you could even apply it when you're working with a customer to help them make a decision, right? Because that would work the same thing, and you can take them through the 5 steps to help them make that decision. So
Yes.
thank you so much. I love that. And last question for you. So obviously you have an accent. Where's that accent from?
It's from the Republic of Moldova, which is a small country in Eastern Europe. My parents came here in 1991 when it was liberated from Soviet domination. So I'm very glad that they left, because Moldova is apparently, what I learned later, one of the least happy countries in the world. So I'm very happy that to not be there.
Yeah. Have you been back?
I've been back about a decade ago for a week. And yeah, I certainly would never want to stay.
Okay. Okay. So it's interesting. So you were pretty young when you moved. So you were about 10 years old, and you still have an accent. So I moved from Russia when I was 13, and I have obviously an accent myself. So I guess we must have missed that like cutoff period where, you know, you just lose it all together. So.
Yeah, I didn't really, there are some people who deliberately try to lose their accent. I didn't really particularly try to lose my accent. I have a desire to retain a link to my cultural heritage. So I chose to just keep my accent and not try to work on it.
Yeah, I think, hey, it's something that makes you different and unique, right? And it's always a conversation started, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I really, really appreciate your time. I think you guys, hopefully you got a ton of value out of this, and how you can overcome those biases, right? And think about your own sales process. So where can we get a copy of your book?
So Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. It's available in bookstores everywhere, in hard copy, digital copy. It's published by a good traditional business publisher called Korea Press. So Barnes Noble, university bookstores, whatnot, online, and Barnes Noble, Amazon, anywhere. You can check out my content at disasteravoidanceexperts.com. Again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com to address disasters in your sales and maximize success. There will be videos, podcasts, there will be articles, consulting, coaching, training opportunities. And if you want a free 8-module video-based course on making the best decisions in the sales process and other life area business areas, go to disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. Again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. And finally, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so connect with me there. Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, GLEB TSIPURSKY.
Great. And I'll be sure to link all that information in the show notes as always, so you guys can connect with Gleb. So thank you so much for being here today. I think, again, I've learned a ton myself, and we'll certainly use those strategies going into 2020. And I will talk to you soon.
I'll look forward to it. And thank you so much for inviting me on the show, Anya.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.